Joining me now from Ottawa is Perry Bellegarde, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Nice to see you, Chief.
Good to be with you, Rosemary.
So one of the big pieces of news this week, of course, was the passing of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The government now has a couple years to come up with an action plan to implement this. How significant is this? What is this going to look like in 2 years, do you think?
I think you're going to create greater economic certainty, and you're going to create provinces and territories ripe for investment in the economy. You're going to start looking at development in lands, resources, and territories. You're going to start looking at, for example, even revenue sharing from a First Nations perspective. There's a key piece within Bill C-15 as well, or the law, is that you have to end racism and discrimination. And we know there's so much systemic racism and discrimination in the healthcare system. Look at Joyce Echelon. We know it's in the justice and policing system. We see all that's going on there. So all of this transformational change, if there's systemic racism and discrimination, you need systemic change. And this is going to be the catalyst or another arrow in our quiver, if you will, that we can shoot to force government to do this.
Right. Speaking of racism and discrimination, it seems like that we are at maybe another turning point in this country. I'm not sure if we've had too many, but around understanding the path to reconciliation. We saw just this week that Kingston is now taking down the statue of Sir John A., perhaps putting it somewhere else, but for now into storage. It's a conversation happening in other parts of the country. Is this what has to happen, do you think, in Canada, that we have to reckon with who we are honoring and putting on monuments?
Well, again, the residential school system in Canada was as a genocide of our people. And we still feel the intergenerational trauma and the effects of that. And it's reflected in all the negative statistics. 40,000 children in foster care, intergenerational trauma. 5 to 7 times the national youth suicide rate in Canada. The disproportionate number of our people in jails, all intergenerational trauma. Missing, murdered, just women and girls. The list will go on and on and on. And it's because of the residential schools. So because of colonization and oppression, you see the genocide. And now there's a waking up. Canadians are waking up. Governments are waking up. And a lot of it is a result of the I won't call it a discovery, but the 215 little spirits waking everybody up at Kamloops. And so we know we have a shared history. And it's not always bright and light around that shared history. We have to do the truth, tell the truth, and embrace that truth as hard as it is. Because more importantly now, we have a shared future. So let's talk about the past, all the good things, the bad things, the ugly things. Embrace that. Yeah. Embrace truth and reconciliation, healing, because now we've got to chart a future for our children and grandchildren and those yet unborn that's respectful of this history, respectful of our diversity, and respectful of all the contributions we've made to Canada, all the land and resources we're sharing. But we got to be respectful of everybody that's here.
When you were first elected in 2014, you laid out some of your priorities: an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, protecting Indigenous languages, asserting First Nations rights entitled, which you talked about there. Do you feel like you are leaving with those things mostly done, on the right road? How are you feeling about those parts of your legacy, if you will?
Well, it's been a very busy last 7 years, Rosemary, being the National Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. It's a big honor and privilege to serve. It's public service. And I think Bill C-5 is done, which is National Day of Reconciliation. Bill C-8 is done, the oath of office, which recognizes treaty rights now for all the newcomers to Canada. Bill C-15, the UN Declaration, which denounces the doctrine of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery, illegal racist doctrines. C-91, the language bill. C-92, the child welfare bill, whereby First Nations law is paramount, and that First Nations can start focusing on prevention, as opposed to apprehension in terms of children. And so there's been movement in terms of legislation. 7 fiscal years, $45 billion dedicated to First Nations issues and priorities. We moved the yardsticks, but progress doesn't mean parity. Mm-hmm. We still have to keep investing in housing and water and infrastructure and education and healthcare. So that gap keeps closing. It's only been 7 years. It's going to take 5, 10, 15, 20 years for that gap to eventually close, because progress does not mean parity, and we got to get to the same starting line.
Indigenous rights, First Nations rights have not always been a priority for political parties. Do you think if, say, we have an election in the months ahead, do you think that has changed? Do you think Conservatives, NDP, Liberals are required to follow through with the same kind of funding that we have seen, as you say, over the past 7 years, and the same kind of policy commitments?
Well, I think that's the biggest thing that's changed in Canada, is the discourse and the dialogue around those family tables, around those supper tables. 10 years ago, we weren't talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. People were just blaming it on a sociological event. We weren't talking about the lack of access to potable water. We weren't talking about the high youth suicide crisis. Canadians are getting it, and that's a real powerful thing. Canada is moving and embracing reconciliation and the time for change. This dialogue was not here, present in Canada 10 years ago. And we have to embrace that now and take advantage of that and capture that in policy and legislative initiatives and continued investments and all those things in every fiscal year. And that's what's changed. And I think going forward, no matter who gets into power, they have to keep with this movement, because it's a groundswell of movement across Canada. And to me, that's bright hope and an inspiration for the future. That's a reconciliation in action.
One of the things that the AFN was doing this week was fighting the government in court around a human rights tribunal ruling that would send a certain amount of compensation to Indigenous children who were put into the child welfare system. As you say, C-92 has passed the idea to download that responsibility to First Nations groups. You are on another track trying to deal with this issue. You have a couple of class action lawsuits where you are trying to reach settlement and negotiate with the government. Why then also pursue it at the Human Rights Tribunal when you have seen that class actions and settlements with the government do seem to work? You do seem to get there. So why to continue to go down the road with the Human Rights Tribunal?
You need a number of strategies to bring about change, to achieve the result. You need a legal strategy, which is the courts and tribunals. You need a political strategy, which is advocating with powers to be in government. And you need political activism as well, people on the ground marching. So you need all three strategies to bring about change. Mm-hmm. So we went to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal and won numerous decisions, and clearly it was pointed out that there is racism and discrimination against children. And we're just saying to government, stop fighting that in court. End your judicial review because you're fighting children. It just makes sense to negotiate a fair compensation package and end the discrimination against children. And that's something we're working on very closely. We don't want to negotiate in public, but we are negotiating with the federal government, and hopefully we get that resolved sooner than later so that the children can get on with their healing and get entitled to some of the compensation that's so necessary to help improve their lives.
What will you miss, Chief? I know you're not going to disappear, but what will you miss from this part of the job?
Well, it's public service, and in Cree we have a word, oskapos. You're a helper or a servant. Whether you're building a Sundance Lodge or helping with the Sweat Lodge or pipe ceremonies, leadership is all about public service. And forever my head, mind, heart, and spirit, I'll be a public servant and helper of the people. And it's just time to take a rest and reset now, and we'll see what the next road turns up.
Well, I'm glad we had the time to chat before you leave. I know we'll speak again, but thanks for making the time today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Rosemary.